This is the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, and I'm your host, Ryan Ray. Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, Episode 4. So great to have you. I'm your host, Ryan Ray. If you haven't gotten enough coverage of President-elect Donald Trump, well, you're about to get more, and you're welcome for that. During the campaign, President-elect Trump made a lot of promises about what he's going to do, some more outlandish than others. So today, we're going to discuss some of those promises, examine the power the president actually has in determining energy policy, and look at what he might overturn from previous administrations. We're going to look forward to his foreign policy and how he's going to interact with China and other nations, along with OPEC. And to help us with that, we're bringing on Dr. Lawrence Fedewa, who's had an extraordinary career in education and technology, and now he also writes for the Washington Times, where he has written over 100 columns discussing, as you can imagine, Donald Trump and other things. We'll link to his information in the show notes. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Fedewa. Dr. Fedewa, thank you so much for coming on today. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm just fine.
Well, it's an honor to have you, and let's get into it. President-elect Trump has said a lot of things on the campaign trail, and you've talked about some of this in some of your articles. How should people interpret what Trump said, and how should they look for President-elect Trump to implement some of his policies moving forward?
Well, I think the first thing you have to understand about Donald Trump is that he is a businessman and not a politician or a diplomat. And as a businessman, he typically would stake out a position that he feels is a good position to start a negotiation with. In fact, if you read The Art of the Deal, he says that explicitly. He'll start off with a position that is the beginning of a negotiation, not the end of a negotiation. And the difference between that and what we're used to is we're used to politicians stating their policy, period. That's their policy. And now you want to talk? We're going to talk about how to implement our policy. And that's not the way he looks at things. He looks at things as, here's what I think. What do you think? And let's try to get together and we'll work out some compromise. So therefore, the opening position is not really where he intends to end up, and I think he's been widely misunderstood in that regard.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard some people speculate that about those same things, and so do you expect him to make some pretty drastic shifts, or do you think it's just minor positioning?
I think it's going to be drastic, and I think it comes from two of the key policy issues that he does believe in as such. Number one, America first. So no more of this free trade that's free for everybody but us. If we're going to trade with anybody, it's going to have to be an equal trade, and everybody's going to have to be happy, particularly us. And the second thing is he's completely dedicated to energy independence. And energy independence means that he's going to open the federal lands to development, particularly oil, but also, I think, renewables. And remember, federal lands in the United States is 26% of the entire land mass of the United States. And that has been off limits from the Obama administration all through this rediscovery of fracking and various other options that we have in terms of developing energy. The other implication of that is that the EPA he's appointed a administrator of the EPA who's been suing the Obama administration regarding all of these executive orders that have been coming down, which are making it almost impossible to use coal for as a fuel. In fact, it's been very anti-fossil fuel altogether. Trump is not anti-fossil fuel at all. In fact, he's committed to pursuing clean coal. I don't know what the chemistry of that is, but that's he is committed to reopening the coal industry in the United States. And I think that those are the two fundamental policies that he's going to follow, and those are extremely dramatic. They're going to change the whole landscape.
Yeah, you touched on something there that actually leads into my next question. Let's talk about executive orders. The past couple presidents have used executive orders to expand their power. Where does the president actually stand as far as what powers does he currently have, and what powers will President-elect Trump use to change the energy industry, and what also might he appeal or end from Obama or Bush or any other president that's kind of hindering the energy industry?
Well, the main thing he's going to do, initially anyway, is to cancel executive orders that were put forward by Barack Obama, and that includes energy and immigration and a number of other things. The implications for the energy industry, as I mentioned, are extremely dramatic. I mean, all of the EPA regulations that were put forward to try to stifle the coal industry, that's all going to be undone. That can be undone by executive order. Regulations in general are executive acts, and therefore they're subject to executive management, including withdrawal. So I think that if you're in the energy industry right now, you better get ready for a whole new ball game.
Well, let's turn to President-elect's cabinet. There's been a lot of talk. I think I saw the other day that I believe it's ExxonMobil. He's looking to maybe bring on a CEO from ExxonMobil, and there's been talk of Continental Resources CEO and Lucas Oil also bringing on them for cabinet positions. It seems to be a very energy-friendly cabinet he's assembling here. Are those all realistic opportunities we're thinking, or is Trump just kind of positioning himself, like you said originally, to put out these big oil and gas names, and then he'll come back with something a little bit more moderate?
Well, of course, I don't know, but my general understanding is that in order to that really one of the fundamental principles of the entire map of initiatives that Donald Trump wants to enact, one of the primary principles is energy, first of all, energy independence, which, frankly, with all of the reserves that we have recently uncovered, means that we are potentially, and rather you would know better than I how quickly we are able to get into complete energy independence from the Middle East or South America or Russia or any place else. And the next step in that, once that is done, it's pretty clear that we're going to be exporting oil. And frankly, if we export oil for example, to Europe, that changes the whole equation between the Europeans and the Russians. Right now, the Europeans are, in general, dependent upon the pipelines that are coming from Russia for a number of their energy needs. If they started looking to the United States instead of Russia for supplying that energy, then that means that Russia's influence in Europe is vastly diminished, and that in turn means all sorts of possibilities relative to the Balkan states and so on. So I think the energy field in general, and the other thing is, by the way, it's not his energy interests are not confined to fossil fuels either. He's very interested in renewables, but as a businessman, he's not interested in subsidizing pipe dreams. He's interested only in developing financially viable sources of energy, which, frankly, we're not that far away in solar, particularly.
Yeah, you brought up renewables there. Let's talk about that. There's been a lot of subsidies over the years. So what you're saying is a Trump presidency is going to reduce or put an end to subsidies for the renewable sector?
I would not be surprised to see them phased out.
One other thing while we're on just kind of broad energy, there's I saw the other day Zambia struck a deal with Russia to build some nuclear power plants. Nuclear, it gets a kind of a bad rap, even though it's pretty safe, and it's really safe actually and really clean. Will we see more nuclear investment in a Trump administration?
I would assume that the restrictions from the environmental point of view on the nuclear construction would begin to be repealed. I don't think it will be done en masse. I think it will be mainly because there's a lot of opposition to changing the environmental requirements for nuclear energy plants. However, I would think that the bias will be generally in favor of nuclear construction, and but if there is additional investment in nuclear energy within the United States, I would assume that it would come from private sources, not from the government.
One of the things that you mentioned a few minutes ago when you talked about energy independence was, pipelines and refineries. Historically, refineries have had a hard time being built in the United States. We have some that, we have some new LNG plants that are going up. How could a Trump administration deregulate those problems and to navigate to allow us to build more refineries here stateside? What would be the things that he would have to do to bring that about?
Well, I think the key to that is the environmental lobbies that are very strong within the Democratic Party, and to the extent that the Trump administration undoes a lot of the environmental concerns about climate control, for example, that would also include the various things we're talking about. I think that the general bias will be in favor of reducing the impact and the influence of the environmental lobbies, which would in turn reduce the number of environmental restrictions on new pipelines. Well, anything. It's not just energy. It's also building buildings and all sorts of things. But I think that there's going to be a lot of reduction in government interference in that sort of thing.
I saw you produced an article the other day talking about the recount in Wisconsin, I believe. President-elect Trump has had a lot of trouble, going through the primary process from the Republican Party, and then after winning, there's been protest, and there's opposition from all sides, it seems. Will he be able to be effective once he gets into office? Do you think some of this will die down, or is it going to be a tumultuous first couple of years for him?
Well, that's good. I'm writing a column right now about that. Those who are old enough to remember what happened in the 1960s, we saw a very relatively long-lasting resistance to the government in terms of both the restrictions on, the Vietnam War, and also in favor of the civil rights movement at the same time. That was a very tumultuous period, and there were a lot of demonstrations, and they were mostly against Democrats at that time. But we could be looking at something like that now too. The left always tries to claim the moral high ground, and that gives them a certain religious fervor that is resistant to compromise and resistance to anything, in many cases, anything except force. So I would not be surprised to see some rather strenuous protesting going on in the next couple of years. That's been true the last couple of years too, by the way. We're in an era when people that disagree with with anything practically, they feel like the thing they should do is get together and go raid or march against a city hall or a university or the federal government or whatever they don't like. So I guess I'd be a little bit pessimistic about peace and tranquility in the first until the United States left gets used to the fact that they lost the election.
Okay, so you mentioned the left there and all the problems that they're causing. What about the right? During the primary and general election, we saw that a lot of senators and congressmen and governors come out against President-elect Trump through this process. Has that rhetoric toned down some, or have they kind of hedged their bets and say that, no, we were against you and we're still going to be against you? What do you see the Republicans doing over these next, the first 2 years at least, before the next set of big elections?
Well, I think the Republicans are pretty much lined up in favor of the Trump movement. I think they've all something like even the popular polls, which have not been all that accurate, but they're still showing about 94% of all Republicans who identify as such as being in favor of Trump now, and I think that definitely carries over to elected officials. There may be some problems when he starts some of his drain the swamp ideas about curtailing the rights of former congressmen and senators from becoming lobbyists within the next. I think he wants a 5-year moratorium. Some things like that may cause some inter-party struggles, but generally speaking, the Republicans are pretty much united now. The problems are a lot more on the Democrat side, I think.
Well, let's turn to foreign policy, and before I kind of get energy specific, kind of lay out what is Trump's foreign policy agenda that he's at least told the general public so far.
Well, I think there the basic principle again is America is first, meaning that whatever alliances or trade deals or relationships actually that the United States participates in with other countries have to be on terms that are favorable to the United States, and particularly the United States workers. So that is going to be a lot of renegotiating a lot of the current superstructure of trade deals. Alliances, I think that the issues are more economic than they are anything else. We ever since 1948, we've pretty much been bearing all of the expense of world peace in terms of not only of equipping the military, but also in terms of our free trade policies. And I think that is going to be modified somewhat significantly. For example, we've been providing a nuclear shield, a no-cost nuclear shield, to the Japanese and the Europeans, particularly the Philippines. There are a lot of other places. I think that businessman Trump is going to want them to start paying their fair share, and that, of course, that's going to raise some hackles here and there. But I don't see that that they really have a lot of choice. They either pay us or they do it themselves, and frankly, trying to catch up with us in any kind of a military fashion is nonsense, really, for even a Japan or a Germany that are well developed technologically. So I think, but I do think that's going to happen. And as far as the overall geopolitical environment, I think again that energy is going to play a major role. I think that energy is going to be really the way in which the American prominence is going to be continued into the 21st century, and that and the function of the military is basically going to be increasingly to protect our supply lines and to protect our engagements and commitments around the world.
I want to touch on something specifically now with foreign policy. The Saudis, they're obviously having some difficulties over the past few years. They kind of hedged their bets on running the Americans out of the oil business, at least temporarily, and it kind of backfired on them. Historically, we've been very friendly with the Saudis because of our need for their oil, but as we've talked about already, those dynamics have kind of shifted. What do we look for with our relationship with the Saudis moving forward over these next 4 years?
Well, that's a good question. The basic problem with the Saudis is that they are simply one tribe among a number of tribes that constitute what is now called Saudi Arabia, and they have, in order to maintain their the domestic peace in their own little kingdom there, they have encouraged a very radical version of Islam, which has really been promulgated throughout the entire Middle East now. It's taken different forms, but remember that Al-Qaeda was basically a Saudi construction, and that so basically what you had was a tolerance on the part of the Saudi the princes and the king, for all of the mosques going around and preaching this very radical Islamic faith. So for them to hold it together, they've had to they did two things. They provided tolerance for the extremists, and then they also supplied practically unlimited money for basically all of the Saudi natives. And that, if America takes over their position, our position as the primary supplier of energy in the world, or even for ourselves, that undercuts the ability of the Saudi government to maintain its very high subsidy of all the. They pay their each Saudi family makes several tens of thousands of dollars a year that just come straight from the government. Well, they're not going to be able to do that. In fact, they're already running into trouble trying to keep that up. And if they do not keep that up, the chances for them to survive politically are vastly decreased. So, to some extent, we're talking about the ascendancy of the United States as a producer of energy equals the decrease in the status and the ability of the Saudis to maintain their traditional lifestyle. That could be a real problem. And if the Saudi, what is now the Saudi kingdom, becomes ruled by extreme, if the king is overthrown and one of the other tribes takes over, and begins to implement a Sharia law that is even more inflexible than what they now have, that could be a real problem for an alliance with the United States, because by that time we're not going to be very tolerant of people that are running around trying to behead Christians. I guess the bottom line is I'm not too optimistic about that situation.
No, exactly, and there's a lot going on with Saudi Arabia. I know I saw the other day that they're looking to bring the Saudi Aramco IPO. That's kind of their big focus right now. And with the dismantling of OPEC, and it's going to be probably a slower process than something's going to happen in the next 4 or even 8 years. It could, but probably closer to a decade we're looking at with that. It's going to be interesting to watch is how President Trump and then whoever succeeds him, or if he gets a second term, handles this international oil deal, because we do buy oil from nations just to help support their economy, and we really don't need to do that anymore, correct?
Yeah, and he isn't going to want to do it when we've got a $20 trillion debt. So, you've got to remember that this guy he's a businessman at heart, and he's not going to want to pay for things that we can't afford, because we're going to have to reduce the debt at the same time when we're trying to increase some of the expenditures for the military and for other parts of the government. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're looking at a different world here in 4 or 5 years.
Well, you mentioned debt, and so anytime you mention debt in the U.S., you think of China, obviously. So what is the relationship with Trump and China? What has he said about China? What can we expect? How those relationships will be moving forward?
Well, I think the assignment of Governor Branstad to the assignment of Governor Branstad as the ambassador to China is a very large peace offering. It should be looked upon as a very pro-Chinese kind of gesture on the part of Trump, because offsetting that is the fact that he has said some very tough things about China, and particularly their ability to manipulate the currency, and so that every time that the Americans start getting a little better shake on competition for imports, they reduce the value of their currency. That currency manipulation is a major factor in the fact that globalization, so-called, has been very detrimental to the United States manufacturing sector. So he's talked a lot about that. He doesn't like the fact that they're building major bases in the South China Sea out of coral and plastic and whatever else they're using. He doesn't like the fact that they haven't helped with North Korea's to put a little bit of or a lot of chain on their activities, which they could do rather quickly because they're the source of most of North Korea's food. And so there are a lot of things that he would like to change regarding the relationship between China and the United States. And he's had tough talk, and yet on the other hand, he appoints an ambassador who's a good friend of their president. So what that says to me is that he wants to talk, and he wants to talk in a nonviolent and mutually beneficial way, but he wants the relationship to be changed significantly. And basically, it also says to me that he doesn't want to make a major enemy of China. He wants to get China together and wants to get them off their high horse to the point where they are more congenial as a fellow world power. Now, what I just said to you is somewhat speculation on my part, because he has not said a lot of this. But I think he's setting up his negotiating position, and that's the way I would interpret it.
Right, and we actually recorded an episode with a energy professional who's a professor actually at Tongji University, and he was talking about all of the transitions that are going on in China right now. You know, you have a lot of government-owned energy businesses, but they're trying to deregulate some of that and bring it into the free market. And there's a lot of debate and conversations that are going on how China is going to handle energy moving forward. So it'll be interesting to watch that. I will let you go with an opportunity to plug or promote anything that we didn't discuss, and we would love to have you on after the first 100 days of President Trump's administration, just to kind of recap what all he's done and what all he said, if that's possible.
Yeah, well, give me a call. I'll be glad to talk. As far as what I'm plugging, I at the moment I'm plugging only my Washington Times columns, which can be found online. Also, I just came out with a book about an entirely different topic, which is not really relevant to any of these discussions. It's a study of the ethics of ecumenism in the thought of H. Richard Niebuhr, who was a very prominent and important philosopher in the period between about 1930 and 1960. So that's a little bit off the topic that we've been talking about today.
Well, send me a link to it, and we'll link to it in the show notes as well. People may want to pick that up. It sounds interesting to me, at least. I like studying broadly like a lot of our listeners do. Thank you so much for being on today. We really appreciate your time, and we will link to where to find you on the Washington Times and Twitter and everywhere else, and we'll put your book.
Yeah, maybe link to, I guess.
Yeah. We'll link to it, and thank you again. And we look forward to talking to you after the first 100 days to kind of recap what Donald Trump has done as a president and how it's going to affect the energy industry moving forward. Thank you again.
Yes, sir.
Thanks again to Dr. Fedewa for coming on. Very insightful stuff there, and we hope to have him on after the first 100 days to discuss how Trump has impacted the energy sector. Now, a few announcements to make. There's actually 2 episodes coming out this week. We're sitting down and discussing the activity that's going on with the protest in North Dakota. And so we have on an interview tomorrow, and so we will record that and release that hopefully on Thursday or Friday of this week. Stay tuned for that. And so we're going to get in there, find out what's going on from someone from that area to cut through some of the mainstream media myths that may be being portrayed about what has actually happened and what is actually going on the ground. Next week, we're going to go to South Africa with a good friend of mine, Ernest Grindelwald, and we're going to have him on the show to talk about what's going on, at least from an electrical power standpoint. So if you're interested in South African energy or just curious what's going on down there, Ernest is going to bring a wealth of knowledge to the situation and tell us some of the obstacles and things that they're facing. And as we get into this conversation, we're going to learn about the government-ran agencies versus the privately ran agencies like we have here in the States, the pros and cons of these methods, and what is going on, and how you're seeing a shift, and especially as we go to China here in a few weeks, how we see a shift in those policies. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much for tuning in. And if you could, please like, comment, and subscribe. Give us some feedback. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, globalenergyleaders@gmail.com is the way to do that. Or you can find me on Twitter @RyanRay Sr. Either way, I will be there. Those will be in the show notes as well. Thanks again for tuning in to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. If you could, please rate, subscribe, review wherever you found this podcast. And until next time, keep climbing.